The city shivered under the embrace of winter, its icy breath cutting through layers of warmth. In a shadowed alley behind a bustling cafe, Samuel Hayes sat on a flattened cardboard box, his meager possessions bundled tightly beside him. Samuel, a man in his late 60s, wore the weight of his past on his weathered face. The once proud soldier, Captain Hayes of the 9th Infantry Division, was now invisible to the world. A steaming cup of coffee sat between his trembling hands, a rare kindness from a stranger who had paused amid the city's relentless rush. Samuel gazed at the cup, its warmth fleeting against the chill of his existence. The streets bustled, but no one noticed him. To them, he was a shadow blending into the gray of their hurried lives. Samuel hadn't always been this way. Once he was a leader, a protector, a hero. But the path from decorated soldier to forgotten man had been paved with battles no one saw, battles of the mind, of loss, and of a society unprepared to welcome him home. The promises of stability and support had vanished, leaving him adrift. Each day blurred into the next, a cold, unforgiving cycle of survival. The cafe manager occasionally offered him leftovers, a fragile lifeline in a sea of indifference. Yet even that came with limits. One frigid evening, a phone call shattered the small solace he had found. The manager, worried about the cafe's image, called the authorities. When the officer arrived, his voice was firm but not unkind. "Sir, you can't stay here. This is private property." Samuel didn't argue. Years of discipline had trained him to obey without question. Quietly, he gathered his belongings, the weight of the world pressing down as he prepared to leave. But the officers stopped him. "I'm sorry, sir," he said softly, "but we've had complaints. I have to take you in." That night, as Samuel sat on the cold steel bench of a holding cell, he stared into the emptiness, his heart heavy with the familiar ache of being unseen. Another night alone, another reminder of how far he had fallen. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as Samuel Hayes stepped inside. His shoulders stooped under the weight of years spent battling ghosts no one else could see. His mismatched jacket, a donation from the shelter, hung loosely on his frame, and his worn shoes pinched his feet with every step. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glare, exposing the cracks in the man who had once stood tall as a protector of his country. Samuel kept his eyes fixed on the ground as he shuffled to the defendant's table. To the gathered crowd, he was just another homeless man, a fleeting headline of pity or scorn. The judge entered, and the room rose in unison. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp, discerning eyes that seemed to pierce through facades. As she took her seat, she began reviewing the cases in front of her, her voice clear and formal. When she reached Samuel's file, her tone faltered. Her eyes flickered to him, narrowing as she read his name again. "Samuel Hayes," she called out, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. Samuel raised his hand slightly. "Yes, ma'am," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The judge's gaze lingered on him as she reread a line in the file, her expression shifting. Leaning forward, she asked, "Mr. Hayes, were you by chance with the 9th Infantry Division?" The room fell silent, the usual hum of courtroom proceedings replaced by a curious stillness. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He nodded slowly, his voice breaking as he replied, "Yes, ma'am, that was me, a long time ago." Her face softened, and she leaned back in her chair, her eyes glistening with an emotion rarely seen in a place so detached from humanity. "My brother," she said, her voice thick with memory, "served in the 9th Infantry. He often spoke of a man who saved his life, a man named Samuel Hayes. Is that you?" Samuel's throat tightened and his eyes filled with unshed tears. I just did what needed to be done," he said, his voice trembling under the weight of those memories. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the crowd's perception of him shifting. No longer was he just a vagrant. He was a hero, a man who had once risked everything for others. The judge cleared her throat, regaining her composure. "This man," she declared, her voice resonating with authority, is a hero. A man who gave so much for his country and yet stands here today, accused of merely seeking shelter from the cold. It's unacceptable. She turned to Samuel, her tone softening. Mr. Hayes, I'm dismissing these charges. Furthermore, I'm ensuring that you receive the assistance you deserve. You've sacrificed too much to be forgotten. Samuel's hands trembled as tears spilled down his cheeks. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. In that moment, he was no longer a ghost, no longer invisible. For the first time, he felt seen. Samuel Hayes walked out of the courtroom into the pale winter sunlight, his steps tentative but lighter than they had been in years. The world felt different, as if the weight pressing down on his shoulders had lifted ever so slightly. For years, he had been a shadow, slipping unnoticed through the lives of others. Now, for the first time, he had been recognized, not for his failures, but for the man he had once been. The judge, whose words still echoed in his ears, had arranged for him to meet a representative from a veterans outreach program. At first, Samuel had been skeptical. Promises had been made before, only to dissolve into the cold reality of bureaucratic indifference. But this time, something felt different. As he entered the small office of the outreach center, he was greeted by a young man with an earnest smile. "Mr. Hayes," the man said, extending a hand. "My name is Daniel Carter. I'm with the Veterans Support Alliance. We're here to help you get back on your feet." Samuel hesitated before shaking Daniel's hand, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against the man's smooth palm. There was a genuine warmth in Daniel's voice, a sincerity Samuel hadn't encountered in years. He sat down, feeling out of place in the clean, organized office, surrounded by posters that read, "We've got your six and no one left behind." Daniel listened as Samuel haltingly shared fragments of his story. The battles he had fought, the comrades he had lost, the struggles that had followed his return home. Daniel didn't interrupt, didn't judge. For the first time in a long time, Samuel felt like his words mattered. Over the next few days, things began to shift. The program arranged for temporary housing in a modest shelter that catered specifically to veterans. It wasn't much, but it was warm and safe, a far cry from the biting chill of the streets. They provided Samuel with clean clothes, warm meals, and, most importantly, the chance to talk to a counselor who specialized in helping veterans navigate their struggles. In the shelter, Samuel met others like him, men and women who had served their country and been forgotten in its shadow. Together, they shared stories, laughed at old war jokes, and mourned the friends they had lost. Slowly, Samuel began to feel a sense of belonging again. One evening, as he sat by the window in the shelter's common room, sipping a cup of tea, he looked out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. For the first time in years, they didn't feel distant or unreachable. They felt like they were calling him forward, toward something better. Samuel Hayes had been invisible, but now hope glimmered on the horizon, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Samuel Hayes found himself in unfamiliar territory. Not the cold, unyielding streets, but a small, sunlit room filled with voices. The veterans' shelter had offered more than just a roof over his head. It had given him a chance to connect with others who understood the battles that followed you home. The scars no one could see. One morning, the shelter director, a compassionate woman named Ellen, approached him. "Samuel," she said, her voice steady but encouraging, "there's a meeting today. A group of veterans who gather to talk and support one another. I think it could help." Samuel hesitated. He had spent so long fighting his battles alone that the idea of sharing his pain felt foreign. But Ellen's kindness and persistence nudged him toward the gathering. That afternoon, he stepped into a circle of folding chairs where a mix of men and women of varying ages greeted him with nods and faint smiles. The group was led by Marcus, a former Marine whose deep voice carried a weight of experience. "Welcome, Samuel," Marcus said, his gaze steady but kind. This is a place where we share our stories, but only when we're ready. Samuel listened as the others spoke, their words weaving a tapestry of grief, resilience, and camaraderie. A young man named Trevor, barely in his 30s, spoke of the nightmares that haunted him. An older woman named Irene recounted her struggle to find work after her service. Each story, though unique, carried echoes of Samuel's own journey. When the circle turned to him, Samuel hesitated, his hands clasping and unclasping as he searched for words. Finally he spoke, his voice uneven but resolute. I served with the 9th Infantry. I spent years thinking the hardest battles were behind me, but coming home. His voice faltered, and he looked down. Coming home was the loneliest fight of all. The room was silent, not out of pity, but in respect. When Samuel looked up, he saw understanding in their eyes. For the first time in years, he felt safe enough to let his guard down. As the meeting ended, Marcus pulled him aside. You've got a lot to offer, Samuel, he said. You've carried heavy burdens, but sharing them lightens the load, for you and for others. That night, Samuel reflected on those words. Maybe he did have something left to give. For years, he had seen himself as broken, a man whose best days were behind him. But now, surrounded by others who had endured and survived, he began to wonder if those fractured pieces could be rebuilt into something stronger. The bridge between his past and future was fragile, but Samuel Hayes was ready to cross it. Slowly, step by step, he began to believe that tomorrow could hold more than shadows. It could hold light. Weeks turned into months, and Samuel Hayes began to carve a place for himself in the community of veterans. At first, he stayed on the periphery, listening more than speaking, learning from the experiences of those around him. But slowly, he found himself stepping forward, offering advice, sharing his stories, and lending a helping hand to those who were just starting to navigate their own struggles. One day, Marcus approached him with a proposal. Samuel, he began, his tone both serious and hopeful. We've been talking about starting a mentorship program here, a way for older vets to guide younger ones who are struggling to adjust to civilian life. You'd be perfect for it. Samuel froze. The idea of being a mentor, a leader again, was both terrifying and exhilarating. I don't know, Marcus, he said, his voice wavering. I'm not sure I have much to offer. Marcus placed a firm hand on his shoulder. You've got more than you think. You've been through the worst of it, Samuel, and you're still here. That's something worth sharing. Reluctantly, Samuel agreed. His first mentee was a young woman named April, a former combat medic who was grappling with the guilt of lives she couldn't save. When they sat down for their first conversation, she barely spoke, her eyes fixed on the ground. Samuel didn't press her. Instead, he shared pieces of his own story, the nights he had spent haunted by the faces of fallen comrades, the years he had felt unworthy of the life he'd been given. As he spoke, he saw April's shoulders relax, her guarded expression softening. I don't know if I'll ever be okay, she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. Neither do I, Samuel replied honestly. But I've learned that it's not about being okay. It's about taking the next step, no matter how small. And you don't have to take it alone. Their sessions became a regular occurrence, and slowly, April began to open up. Samuel found himself drawing strength from their conversations, realizing that in helping her, he was also helping himself. Word of Samuel's mentorship spread, and soon others sought his guidance. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was making a difference. The shelter became more than a place to sleep. It became a hub of hope, a space where veterans supported each other in rebuilding their lives. One evening, as Samuel walked back to his room, he passed a small bulletin board covered in photos and messages of gratitude from those he had helped. His gaze lingered on a handwritten note from April. Thank you for reminding me that I'm not alone. For the first time in years, Samuel felt something he hadn't dared to hope for. Pride. He had found a new mission. Not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, everyday acts of connection and kindness. And in that mission, he was rediscovering the man he had always been, a leader, a protector, and now a mentor. Samuel Hayes had once believed his story was over, but now he realized a new chapter had just begun. Samuel's days began to fill with purpose. The once empty hours that stretched endlessly before him were now spent mentoring, listening, and guiding others like April. The veterans community had grown into a second family, bound not by blood, but by shared struggles and a commitment to rebuild. One afternoon, as Samuel sat in the shelter's common room sipping a cup of coffee, Ellen approached him with a curious smile. "Samuel, there's someone here to see you," she said. Samuel's brow furrowed. "Me? Who?" "You'll see," she replied, beckoning him toward the lobby. There, standing awkwardly by the door, was a familiar face. Margaret, the manager of the cafe where his troubles had begun. She clutched a small paper bag in her hands, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Samuel felt a mix of emotions, surprise, unease, and, surprisingly, no bitterness. "Mrs. Anders," Samuel said, his tone polite but guarded. "What brings you here?" She flinched at the formal address, her voice faltering. "Please, call me Margaret. I wanted to apologize." Samuel's eyebrows rose, but he said nothing, allowing her to continue. "I've thought about what happened that night," Margaret said, her words spilling out in a rush. "I was so worried about the cafe's image, I didn't stop to think about what you were going through. When I heard about everything, the courtroom, the judge, your service, I realized how wrong I was. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I had to tell you I'm sorry." Samuel studied her for a moment, then gestured to a nearby chair. "Sit," he said simply. Margaret hesitated before taking a seat, the paper bag still clutched tightly in her hands. She placed it on the table between them. "I brought this for you," she said, her voice soft. "Just some fresh bread and pastries. It's not much, but—" Samuel looked at the bag, then back at her. He could see the genuine remorse in her eyes. "Margaret," he said, his voice steady, "you don't owe me anything. What's done is done, but I appreciate your words and your kindness." Her eyes welled up with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "And if you ever want to stop by the cafe, you're welcome. No questions, no judgments, just coffee and a place to sit." Samuel nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thank you," he replied. After she left, Samuel sat quietly, the paper bag untouched. He didn't feel the anger or resentment he had once carried. Instead, he felt an unfamiliar lightness, a sense of forgiveness, not just for Margaret, but for himself. Later that week, Samuel surprised himself by walking into the cafe. Margaret greeted him with a genuine smile, handing him a cup of coffee without a word. He sat by the window, watching the city bustle past, feeling not like an outsider, but a part of the world again. As he sipped the warm coffee, he realized something profound. People could change, and so could he. Forgiveness was not just an act of grace for others, but a gift to himself, a chance to let go of the past and embrace the present. Samuel Hayes was no longer the invisible man. He was becoming something more. A bridge between the shadows of his past and the light of what lay ahead. Months passed, and Samuel Hayes's life began to resemble something he hadn't thought possible. Stability. His role as a mentor at the shelter expanded, and his name became synonymous with hope among the veterans. The small victories, helping someone find a job, guiding a struggling soul through a dark moment, became his new battles, and he fought them with the same tenacity he had once brought to the front lines. One crisp autumn morning, Samuel received a call from Ellen. "There's a community event next week," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "It's a ceremony to honor veterans. They've asked if you'd be willing to share your story." Samuel was silent for a moment, the weight of the request sinking in. "Me?" he finally asked, incredulous. "Yes, you," Ellen said with a laugh. "You've inspired so many people, Samuel. It's time others heard what you've done, not just in the past, but now." Reluctantly, Samuel agreed. When the day arrived, he stood backstage, his heart pounding. The hall was packed with people, families, veterans, community leaders. At the front of the room hung a large banner, honoring those who serve, then and now. When his name was called, the applause was thunderous. Samuel walked to the podium, his steps steady despite the nerves coursing through him. He adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath. "I'm not sure what you all expect to hear from me," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not a perfect man, far from it. I've stumbled, I've fallen, and for a long time I thought I'd never get back up." The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. "I served my country with pride," he continued, "but when I came home I felt like I didn't belong. I lost my way, and for years I believed the world had forgotten me." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "But I was wrong, because even in the darkest moments there were sparks of light. Acts of kindness, second chances. Those sparks brought me back to life." Samuel shared his journey, his struggles, his pain, and the people who had helped him rediscover his purpose. He spoke of April, Marcus, and the shelter, and of how he had found a new mission in lifting others up. "As veterans, we're taught to never leave anyone behind," he said, his voice growing stronger. "But that doesn't end when the uniform comes off. We need each other, and we need to remember that no matter how far someone falls, they can rise again, with the right support." When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Strangers approached him afterward, thanking him for his words, for his service, and for his courage. Among them was a young boy who handed Samuel a small, handmade card. On it was scrawled in shaky letters, "Thank you for being a hero." Samuel's throat tightened as he accepted the card. He wasn't sure he deserved the title, but for the first time, he felt worthy of the respect it implied. By the end of the year, Samuel had moved into a small apartment provided by the Veterans Program. The walls were adorned with photographs, his old unit, his new friends, and a framed copy of the boy's card. Each image was a testament to his journey, a reminder of the lives he had touched and the resilience he had found. On a chilly December evening, Samuel sat by his window with a cup of coffee in hand, gazing out at the city lights. The cold no longer seemed as biting, the world no longer as indifferent. He thought about the people who had helped him along the way and the ones he had helped in return. For the first time in years, Samuel Hayes allowed himself to dream. Not of battles fought or victories won, but of the life still waiting for him. He smiled, a quiet, contented smile, knowing that his story wasn't just one of survival. It was one of renewal, of purpose, and of light. Samuel was no longer defined by the shadows of his past. He was a beacon for others, proof that even the darkest nights could give way to brighter days. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.